Well, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV as we continue our current look around the Terry Pickering classic motorcycle collection. Now, we did look at Terry's lovely and rare HIS in my last video posting, but right now we're going to take a look at another fantastic machine that Terry recently restored. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at Terry's 1973 MX250 Yamaha. Okay, so as you're probably aware, we are continuing with our current series of looking through more of the classics from the Terry Pickering motorcycle collection. And this next example here that we're going to take a look at is Terry's 1973 MX250 Yamaha, which is another of the many bikes from his collection that's recently undergone a complete refurbishment. And so the history and the background of this bike really all began while it was an off-roader over there in the USA, where this particular Yamaha was originally owned and raced since 1973. Now, Terry told me that this particular bike here was part of a consignment of machines that Terry imported into the UK through a family member who also imported classic cars into the country. So Terry made good use of his family connections and had this bike and a few others added to a shipment of cars that were being sent from America into Great Britain. Now, when all of the bikes arrived into the country, this 73 Yamaha 250 and a few of the others were all more or less complete bikes, but they were all in a pretty dreadful state, as Terry told me, and they needed quite a lot of TLC and recommissioning. And because Terry's hobby is classic dirt bike restoration, putting this machine back to a decent kind of condition wasn't going to be a problem, although there was still quite a lot of work to get through to bring this 50-plus-year-old classic back to a reasonable condition, because after having 50 years of abuse on the track, more or less every single component on this bike needed work. And so, as with all of these kind of restoration projects, the first thing to do was completely strip the bike down to its individual component parts and take an inventory of what needs done and what parts were required. And when Terry performed this task, it was quite evident that a few replacement parts were going to be required, and others that weren't available as new old stock replacements would have to undergo some kind of refurbishment. So as far as I'm led to believe, Terry's first task was to check out the bike's chassis, which after 50 years on the planet had certainly been battered and bruised from its time on the track in the USA, although surprisingly the bike's frame and the swing arm were in quite decent condition, although it did need some kind of light repairs and quite a bit of cosmetic refurbishment. So this tubular steel frame was then sent out to be completely stripped back to its bare metal so that it could be better inspected for any signs of damage that could then be repaired before it was then given a brand new glossy covering of black powder coating. And also, while that chassis was being brought back to life, some of the smaller parts of the frame also had their day in the paint shop, including the bike's rear swing arm and parts like the footrests and the rear chain guide, the side stand and rear brake anchor arm, which were all refurbished at the same time. So once the chassis was all repaired and repainted, then Terry could move on to the rest of the other parts of the bike. And although, unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of the bike prior to its restoration, there was still a lot of work to do on this machine. And while we're here on the subject of the bike chassis, you can see that our particular 250 here still has its stock original side stand fitted, which is quite rare on one of these old Yamahas, because most of the owners did tend to just remove these parts because they only added extra weight to the bike, and they never really served any practical purpose on what was an off-road motocross race bike. Although I must say this side stand did come in quite handy when I was shooting the pictures of the bike on the day, because my intention was to get the bike all nicely set up on a nice grassy park with a good background, although Terry's particular part of the country at that time had just come through a massive storm and a flood, and so the grass, as you can expect, was a bit like quicksand. And as I said, this bike's side stand did come in quite handy on the day to prop the bike up on the much more solid concrete base. But when Yamaha launched this bike in the early 1970s, of course this was direct competition to Honda's recently introduced 250 and 125 Elsinores, which I think also came in about that same time. And these 250 MX Yamahas certainly had some competition in that year, so this bike had to be good if it was going to entice motocross racers away from their beloved Elsinores, which of course were selling in their droves in that year. But nevertheless, this MX250 was also a decent bike that even for the early 1970s still had a very good list of specifications of its own. And in fact, overall, this 250 and even its bigger brother, the 360, had very little in the way of vices or idiosyncrasies that hindered the bike's performance, because it did have a good, strong steel chassis and swing arm, and of course a stonking 250 reed valve motor, although the suspension on the front and at the back wasn't exactly the best. But you have to remember that this was still the early 1970s, so suspension technology was almost non-existent at that time, and bikes like our MX250 Yamaha and even the Honda Elsinores for that matter were still using what was basically road bike motorcycle suspension systems. But no mistaking, these 250s certainly had the look. So as we move on to the MX250's motor, now as I mentioned, this engine here was the beating heart of the 250 Yamaha, and for one of Yamaha's earliest attempts at building a purpose-built motocross engine, they certainly appeared to tick all of the boxes that the specifications required to construct what was a light and compact competitive scrambles engine. So basically this was an air-cooled two-stroke, which, as I remember, I think had a 5-speed gearbox, and it was fueled through a Japanese Mikuni carburetor and reed valve block, which of course made this engine both very powerful and smooth right through its entire rev range. And in terms of its output, these MX 250s I think were said to pump out around the 30 horsepower mark, which was quite something for such a compact and light two-stroke power plant. And again, as I remember, I think from the factory in 1973, these 250s would have been fitted with Yamaha's Auto Lube oil lubrication system, which really consisted of a separate tank to hold the oil and a small pump that would be behind this cover here at the end of the crankshaft. So there was no need to premix the oil and the petrol together before adding it to the tank. You just put plain gas inside the tank, and the little pump would then distribute lubrication to all of the important parts of the engine through a series of small tubes. But many owners simply just removed the pump and its storage tank just to make things a lot more simpler and reduce some of the weight on the bike, and then they just simply mixed the oil and gas together before adding it into the tank, which is exactly what's happened here on our particular engine. And so fueling this 250 engine was a reed valve intake, which was quite a new thing for a two-stroke engine in 1973, and it was normally a good quality Mikuni carburetor that was used to mix that air and the fuel in the correct proportions for combustion. And in the air filter department, it was a foam type filter that was hidden away in this plastic air box here at the back of that Mikuni carburetor. And also in 1973, these Yamaha two-stroke engines had things like these anti-vibration rubbers that were slotted in between the cooling fins of the barrel, and these I think were just to try and cut down on some of the noise from the engine when the fins would vibrate. And this was a feature that not only was used on these off-road engines, but it was also employed and put to good use on many of the Yamaha road bikes of that 1970s era. But moving on to the Sparks side of the MX250. Now, even for 1973, Yamaha were already using state-of-the-art CDI electronic ignition systems on these engines, which of course was a big step up from those old and quite unreliable contact breaker ignition setups in the past. So this CDI ignition was certainly for 1973 state of the art. But I do remember Terry telling me that when he first came across this engine after delivery, it was in a pretty sorry state and it needed quite a few replacement parts. But of course it was treated to a full strip down and rebuild, and all of the associated bearings and gaskets and seals were naturally all replaced with some of the other things like a full rebore and new piston and crank parts to eventually finish up with what is now basically a brand new 250 Yamaha engine. Now, one of the parts on this bike that didn't really need a lot of work was the engine's exhaust expansion chamber, which, despite its age, was still in very good condition considering the abuse it must have taken down the years, as it only had some minor damage with just one or two little dings in that pipe. So basically all it really needed was a quick rub down to remove the old flaky patina that was left on the pipe, and then treat it to a brand new coat of matte black heat resistant paint. And as we make our way onto the rear of the bike's exhaust, you can see that it appears that the silencer tail cone is missing from this pipe, which I'm sure Terry still has in his possession, and I think he's maybe just forgotten to fix it back onto the bike, because he was doing some kind of work on this bike prior to my visit, so he's maybe just removed it to repaint it, or maybe just forgot to put it back on. So more than likely, even by now, this silencer has now been refitted to the pipe. So anyhow, moving onto the front suspension department of our American imported Yamaha, where we had these relatively basic front forks, which for their day certainly worked good enough on a reasonably flat racetrack, although these were maybe a bit on the soft side for any kind of rough or bumpy tracks, because for the early 1970s there was very little in the way of making adjustments to the rebound or damping on these forks, but you could certainly still experiment with maybe harder springs or different weights of fork oil just to try and stiffen them up a bit. But this isn't a criticism of the Yamaha engineering. This is just, as I've said on numerous occasions when it comes to these old 1970s classics, this was the suspension technologies of their day, so this is really what you had to work with. And to be fair, there wasn't really a lot of choice to upgrade or even fit more rugged suspensions on your 1970s racers. And I suppose much the same could be said about the Yamaha's front and the rear brakes, because these were your old school vintage stoppers, which surprisingly still did quite a good job of slowing or stopping our 250, considering its 200 odd pounds of dry weight. But these antiquated shoe and drum brake systems were still considered the motorcycle braking technology of its day. And although these drum and shoe systems weren't super powerful, they still did a very good job. But again, here at the back end of our 250, it was quite a sizable rear drum brake for the bike's size and weight. And if you actually look a little bit closer, you can also see another long lost item that you no longer see on these kind of motorcycles, a little grease nipple there so that you can lubricate that wheel spindle, which again, these grease nipples were used on many of the old motorcycles in the past, but of course nowadays these little parts are virtually unheard of. And here on the other side of the rear hub, you can see that the bike appears to still have a quite sizable rear drive sprocket. And just in case you're interested, both of the front and this rear wheel are still the self-same alloy rims that Yamaha fitted to the bike at the factory in 1973. And rear suspension-wise on our American Yamaha, it would have come from Yamaha HQ back then with a very basic pair of rear shocks, or dampers as I think they were called back then, and these once more would have been probably worse than useless on a bumpy rough track, because they were basically just lightweight springs with sealed oil-filled dampers inside. But as long as your racetrack was as smooth as a billiard or snooker table, then there normally wouldn't be a problem, although anything that was rougher than that would certainly turn your MX250 into a badly behaved bucking bronco. But naturally these old shocks are now long gone and no longer available, thankfully. So when Terry was putting this bike back together, he's now opted to fit a pair of these quite decent quality Hagen classic shocks, which are very basic, but they're still very well engineered and certainly in keeping with the old style classic looks of this Yamaha 250 bike. So from the back end of the bike, we move on to the MX250's fuel storage tank, which again, as you can see, was quite well designed and slim enough to keep the rider's legs tucked neatly into that chassis. And I think if my aging memory hasn't left me completely, I'm pretty sure that these tanks were still being made from steel in 1973, as plastic ones were still a few years along the track as yet. But these fuel cells here, I think, held just under the 2 gallons of fuel, so there was certainly enough gas in there to keep our 250 reed valve motor buzzing along quite happily. But this tank here was also one of the many parts that Terry had refurbished during the bike's restoration, and although the original paint and the logos on the tank were worn out, this fuel cell here was still taken back to its bare metal finish and was then professionally prepped and repainted in this Yamaha yellow before a brand new set of tank graphics were then added to make this part of the bike as good as all the other refurbished items that made up this fantastic looking motorcycle. But it's always surprised me why these old vintage dirt bikes never had a little bit more padding in their bikes' racing seats, because let's face it, with the very limited suspension movement that these bikes had in their day, you'd think that any extra millimetre of soft foam padding would certainly go a long way to help make the riders ride a little bit more comfortable. But nevertheless, this is another reflection of the times, and this seat again was completely redone by Terry using the original seat base and the original foam before he sourced a brand new replacement seat cover from the USA to complete this part of the bike's build. Next up, it's time to make our way around the bike's bodywork. Now, these side panels certainly look like the proper plastics for the 73 250, and even have the original twist and remove fasteners there to keep them in place on the chassis. But I'm not entirely sure if these actually are the same parts that came with the bike when it arrived from the USA, because I do know that Terry did purchase quite a lot of replacement items to finish the bike, so these could even be reproduction panels that Terry sourced from a Yamaha supplier. But they certainly look the business here on our 250. And again, here at the front of the bike, we've almost certainly got a pair of reproduction mudguards, because there's no way that this bike here would still have its stock original mudders after 50 odd years of track action. Although again, these parts here do look every bit as good as those Yamaha original items, and of course these parts again are made of plastic as they were in that year. Where on the other hand, this plastic front number plate is not what I think it should be bolted onto these 250s in that year, because I'm pretty sure it was just a standard oval type plate that was fitted to these race bikes. But Terry did insist that this was the type of plate that was fitted to the bike when it turned up in the UK, so maybe even this bike's been raced as a flat tracker while it was still in the USA, because I do know that these bikes did have this sort of squarish looking plate on their flat track racers. But moving up here to the business end of our MX250, appears to have a pair of period correct handlebars from that year, although I think that Yamaha crossbar pad there is maybe a recent modern addition to the bike. But as I've said in some of my other videos, you can usually tell if your old classic has the original handlebars fitted, because more often than not, the crossbar on those handlebars is usually welded on, as was the procedure of its day. And also here at the left-hand side of the handlebars, on the clutch side, Terry, you can see, has managed to source the correct alloy levers and grips that were stock on these bikes in '73. And you can also see that an engine kill switch has also been added, just in case of any kind of emergency with that 250 engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. But to control all of those ponies that are waiting to be let loose from that very quick 250 reed valve Yamaha engine, a steady hand was certainly required on this EMGO Yamaha throttle gasser to keep control of the 30 or so horsepower that the two-stroke power plant was reputed to deliver. So although this was just a small compact 250 racer, it could still certainly hustle along if you were brave enough to keep this gasser pinned back. So as you can see from what was initially a quite rough and scrappy looking tired race bike from the USA to this fantastic example of a 1973 MX250 Yamaha. And I do remember Terry telling me on the day that this bike here was an absolute pleasure to work on, and it was basically because it was so well built by Yamaha in the first place. And when Terry came to buying replacement parts to refurbish the bike, he says every single component fitted exactly into place with absolutely no need for adjustment or re-engineering, which is testament to just how well these bikes were built in the first place. But as I said, this 250 was just one of a consignment of machines that Terry had imported into the UK from the United States. And he's also restored a lovely 1974 MX360 Yamaha that we're going to take a look at quite soon here on my channel, which has also been put back to almost as brand new condition. So make sure that you don't miss out on that. So you can understand exactly why I do keep in touch with Terry, because not only does he have some of the nicest and rarest off-roaders in the UK, he's also got a massive warehouse of bikes and parts that are all waiting their turn to be reborn into brand new motorcycles once again. And it's machines such as this lovely MX250 Yamaha that keep me going back to Terry's collection each and every year. Okay, so coming up next, we're going to take a quick break from Terry's collection and just take a look at this exquisite wrap BSA Bantam trials bike that I spotted at the Telford show this year, because some of my subscribers have certainly asked why we don't feature more trials bikes on my channel. So we're going to put that right in my next video posting, where we can check out this superbly engineered trials Bantam. So thanks once again for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV. So until the next time, it's goodbye for now.